fairness, this is not a video that I normally make. This is somewhat of a Paul's thoughts and opinions on a press release, believe it or not, but it was interesting enough that I wanted to get on a camera and probably harvest your thoughts and ideas as much as share my own, to be fair. Now, it is interesting because it is from Princeton, and we've been talking about Princeton recently on the back of Harrison doing that interview on GCN. Remember, we talked about the UCI drop test and also been talking through some aerodynamics. I've got a set of scopes here that I want to talk through as well, and some light bicycle rims, because I don't actually have these wheels here in front of me. I think today is embargo day, so you're probably going to see it all over YouTube. Now, what is interesting about this is that Princeton makes some very high quality wheels, no doubt about it. They're some of the nicest quality wheels you can buy. Their aerodynamics have been up there, but definitely not the best. Their weights have been up there, definitely amongst the best, but not the best. So the standout, sort of the trilogy of things that you might look for in a wheel set have all been there, but at a very high price. Now, the other interesting thing about this is this comes on the back of us being at Core Bike, where we went to go and visit Princeton, and their distributor, Ison Distribution here in the UK, had just told us that they had ceased distribution. So you might not even be able to get these wheels in the UK, but it's interesting because there's a lot of change afoot. What Princeton have been really working on, and when I was talking to Harrison, he was just tearing his hair out. In fact, you might remember, if you've been watching the channel a long time, 2 years ago, I talked to Harrison at the Roulaire live show. And in that interview I gave with him, he was talking about his frustration about tyre manufacturers not making enough widths of tyres to get a really good understanding of the most optimum aerodynamics. He was saying that we don't just need 28 to 30, 32, we need a 29, we need a 31, so that when we're working with, internal rim measurements, we can look at what does a 29 do on a 23mm compared to a 30. Well, he did it. Essentially, he's gone out there and he's made rims, and he's brought nearly every single tyre combination to make sure that he really understands that profile that is created when you mount a tyre onto a wheel. Remember, that tyre becomes pretty much the leading edge, and it's really important where the airflow comes from that position. So in this press release, he has talked through how he has taken 4 different hooked rim widths, 21, 22, 23, 24, and every single tyre width that he can get within, I think it's from like 28, which is like pretty much standard now, 29 with those new Vittorias, and 30. Anyway, you get the idea. Done, put everything through CFD, honed down on the ones that they could see were being the most efficient, and then have now introduced the new Evolution 2 of their Wake 6560. So the 6560 comes from, remember, Princeton have that variable depth where at the deepest point it's 65 millimeters, and then it goes down to 60 millimeters. Now that wavy depth, if you remember, was fought out with Zip in like a legal battle as to who patents that. But the idea of that was that in a crosswind situation, that the air is disrupted enough that you don't get that sort of violent twitchy handling. Again, if you remember watching the channel when I reviewed the Karima wheels, probably the worst performing crosswind I've tried recently, then a crosswind came across and makes little vortices, and even that time you just don't get that predictable handling. You always feel the wind, but what you don't want is the wheel to snatch in front of you and you feel like you've got to control it and react to it. With Princeton, they're probably one of the most well-behaved wheels that I've ever ridden, alongside the Zip 454s, to be fair. Very, very similar. When you hit that side wind, it's predictable. It's like a gentle push, a push that you feel like you can just lean into and lean out of as the gusts blow in. In fact, it makes it feel really, really confidence-inspiring when you're riding at speed. Anyway, back to this. This is their Evolution 2, and they needed one because it's probably been about, I think, what they're saying is about 8 years since the last iteration. So a lot has changed then. So we're expecting a fairly big jump, mostly because we've got new carbon fibers from Terai. The modulus has probably gone from like a 700 from back in 2015, 2016. And we're now looking at, moduluses of 1100 from Terai, etc. And also their Tactic hubs have been evolving and getting better and better and lighter as well. So this little graph is what really caught my eye. And you've probably seen these. I've got some here from Cycling News, etc. Now this graph represents the drag force in grams. It's not measuring CDA, so the graph is the opposite way around than what you're used to seeing. But imagine that this pencil is the rider. This little red tip here is the tyre hitting the air, and this is at 0 degrees just here. The white line represents their old wheel, the Evolution 1, if you like. And so you can see that as you go through the points of yaw, that the drag reduces somewhat. Now, until you get down to about 15 degrees, and then all of a sudden, at about 15 degrees, it spikes up again. Now, normally, you don't get that. So the cycling news ones normally stop at 14, 15 degrees. They don't go beyond that. Now, what's interesting with this is because your wheels, and now if you look at the data that came from the back of the Factor 1, can, in some situations, become somewhat of a sail. And it's interesting because the aerodynamics have got to a point where we're now discovering at what sort of angles we can create a little bit more of a boost. Now, interestingly, this is more relevant to slower riders because if anyone knows anything about sailing, your side wind is never just a full-on side wind. So if we can imagine our bike is here and it is stationary and we're hit by a 90-degree wind through here, then we feel the full effect of it. But the second that we are moving, we get what's called the apparent wind. And the faster you go against that 90-degree side wind, the yaw angle becomes less and less. So if you were stationary, it would be here, and the faster you go, your yaw angle comes here and here and here. So essentially, the slower you go, the more aerodynamic advantage to a point. There comes a point where the aerodynamics aren't really affecting anything. But this is what they've been honing in on because Princeton are fairly followed by triathletes who tend to ride at a slower pace, especially sort of Ironman, because they've got a run to do, they've just come out of a really long swim, etc. And also they tend to ride on like big coastal locations as well, where you get really big side winds, which is where Princeton are really, really famous because they react so well in those side winds. But if you look here, down at 17.5 degrees, we almost meet 0 grams of drag force. This is because you've got a disc rotor on one side and not on the other side, etc. Point is, the little bar chart at the bottom here represents the delta, the difference between their Gen 1 and their Gen 2. And you can see where they put all the effort in, where they found the gains are at these extreme yaw angles. Now, a fast rider wouldn't normally experience that because they would be going 40, 48 kilometers an hour, and the faster you go, the yaw angle comes off. So they tend to ride, it's generally accepted, in sort of the 10 to 15 degree angles, where a slower rider, somewhere around the 30 kph, is probably more likely to experience these higher yaw angles. Now, don't get me wrong, these wheels are not going to suddenly make a slower rider faster. A faster rider putting out more power is still going to be faster on a course, but a slower rider will benefit more. So I was running some numbers on AI, and essentially on a time trial course, for instance, a fast rider might finish the course in 50 minutes or something, and they might save 20 seconds by having this wheel. A slower rider that might finish in an hour 20 might benefit to like 45 to a minute by having their bike in more of that sail effect sweet spot. So what Princeton are essentially doing is trying to do what Factor did and unlock that sweet spot where the side wind and the apparent wind reduce the drag significantly and become somewhat of a sail. Interesting era of aerodynamics, which is why I wanted to jump on this video and make it, because it's gone away from what Scope are doing. Now, Scope were famous when they got the cycling news test. They had the lowest CDA at 0 degrees, pretty much the lowest CDA all the way up to about 14. And that was great. CDA at those sort of angles are great, but they're not necessarily that valid for everyday riders or people doing longer distance stuff. So you're doing your Grand Fondos or your ultra distance things, whereas Princeton normally find their audience in the longer distance, slightly slower speed events, and it looks like they're really tapping into that market, which is pretty interesting. Now, you guys are going to ask about the weight reduction. Well, they've taken their weight of their rim from down to 470 down to 420 grams. That's an expected difference because they haven't updated it for so long, and carbon technology has moved on quite a lot in that time. And they've obviously updated their Tactic hubs as well. So they've got down here their Tactic TR01 hubs, the top of the range one at 1250, which is pretty much going to be the same weight as a set of Scope AirTech 60s, 4,100 pounds, which at the current exchange rate is around $4,000, which current exchange rate is about £3,000. Now, the interesting thing about Princeton losing their distributor was because it was really hard in the UK to buy Princetons, to be fair, because you'd buy them, you'd look at the price on the Princeton website, and then you'd add VAT, you'd add import duty, you'd need to add the distributor's margin, some shipping on there. So they normally came out extremely expensive by the time you added all of that. So I think what they're probably going to be doing is going direct to consumer and trying to get those prices down, because £3,000 is now really competitive with scope and zip, to be fair. So an interesting new era perhaps happening here. One thing they will be happy about, and again, I don't want to share this data too much, but this is where they were trying to win their market share. These are the cycling news tests. And again, at 50 kph, the Princetons, the old ones, perform very well. They're up there in the top 6, I think it is. 40 kph, they're definitely midfield, just behind the Campagnolo Bora. But at Watts at 30 kph, they were almost right down the bottom, right next to Shimano Dura-Ace. Now, I think what they're trying to do is make their wheels much more appealing to a much broader market by trying to improve the aerodynamics at a wider yaw angle. So applaud that. And I've also just got this on the table. This has just landed. This is the stuff from Light Bicycle, coming in very, very wide, 25 millimeters, but also trying to do something to break up the airflow. And everyone's taking a slightly different tack to trying to break up the airflow as it hits the side of the wheel. So the Campagnolo Shimals, those Elite wheels, those Elite Helixes that we had. I'm definitely a fan. The wheels that do something to try and break up the airflow always tend to have slightly better handling. The scopes, I've only sort of ridden these very, very short distances, so they're not as good in the crosswinds, but they definitely feel lovely and responsive when you get them spun up. So an interesting era of aerodynamics ahead of us, I think. Okay, I'm done rabbiting on. If you want to know more about those Princetons, get down in the comments. I'm going to try and get in contact with Harrison and see if we can get a set here, because they look like they're onto a killer product and sort of back in the game. So anyway, over to you. Get down in the comments. What have you learned from this? What else is there to consider? I'm really keen to know. Cheers.